Well, it's so good to be with you again and to be past that coronavirus that prevented me from being with you earlier. I have to admit, however, I have an ongoing coronavirus, which the major symptom of which is affection for you all. I bet you hear that joke all the time. Anyway, I also wanted to let you know, Tim McConnell knows I'm up here, and the senior pastor at First Pres, and he wanted me to bring greetings from the congregation to let you know how much First Pres appreciates you and your dual ministry. First Pres is invested in you. So let's read the text of Scripture today, and I'm going to read it with a couple of textual variations. That's just a nerd alert for you, okay? Hear the word of the Lord. There was also a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Penuel, or Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84, or she was a widow for 84 years. She never left the temple, but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. This is the word of the Lord. I have to say, I am really drawn to this text as well as the preceding few verses about Simeon, because these verses lift up geezers, of which I am one. Now, I know that you're in this series on formation, and you have some wonderful resources that help you understand how your identity is given to you, how it's nurtured, how it's activated. And I highly recommend those sources that you have posted. But since you don't have enough to read, I thought I'd recommend yet another resource. It's called A Pastoral Rule. While this has been written for pastors, its principles apply to every single disciple of Jesus. And one of the things I like about this book is that it points out the very simple truth of reminding us that if we don't establish patterns of formation, others will do it for us to suit their own particular needs. Now, I'm not the best person to speak on disciplined habits of Christian formation. I'm in that baby boom generation that thought that rules and disciplines were legalistic, and that we should have a free-form approach to Christian growth. That was more authentic. But what we discovered over time was that a free-form approach often ended up being a no-form approach. That mistaken attitude has now produced yearnings for helpful and consistent patterns that grow our relationship with the Lord. And Anna is a good example of that. So what do we know about Anna? As we answer that, we must remind ourselves of one of the necessary understandings that we have to have as we approach the Bible. Our confessions assert that the Bible tells us everything that is necessary for our salvation and for the framing of a life that is pleasing to God. So if some information is not there that we would like to have, quite frankly, we don't need it. And what is there is useful, no matter how trivial it seems. What we know of Anna is only in this passage. We are given her name, which is a form of Hannah, which takes us back to the story of the birth of Samuel, a prophet whom God used to direct Israel's kingly destiny. Anna's father is Penuel or Phanuel, and it's a variation of the same name, and that means the face of God. And here's another interesting fact. She comes from the lost tribe of Asher, and Asher means happy or contented. Giving us these names tells us something both about God and about Anna. First of all, Asher. That tribe has been lost in the mists of time. They were exiled for unfaithfulness, and they just sort of disappeared. But here's a member of that tribe who surfaces, and she's totally dedicated to God. Well, I've almost lost my place. This assures us, and this is what I found interesting about this, and you get this just from the name Asher, is that whenever we think from a human standpoint that people are lost to God, that's according to our human perspective, but it assures us that they are never lost to God. And so we never give up hope for those that we think are beyond redemption. The names of her father and her tribe, face of God, and happy and content, imply that Anna's contentment and longevity in the service of God were a result of her diligently and consistently seeking the face of God. You know, I have a friend whose toddler son climbed into bed with them early one morning, and he kept repeating the word God. I mean, he just went on, God, 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 God. When asked why he was doing this, Ben told his mom and dad, my Sunday school teacher said we had to think about God all the time, and I can only think about God when I say God. If I don't say God, I'll think about something else. For a toddler, he had a pretty good insight into how easily we can be distracted from seeing God in every moment of our lives. Anna was not distracted. We know that Anna was elderly. What is not clear is exactly how old she is. She is either 84 years old or she had been a widow for 84 years. If she was a widow that long, her age is likely to be 105, which matches the age of the Jewish heroine Judith. The most detailed and recent scholarship, however, leans toward believing that Anna was indeed a centenarian. Now, nerd alert. Either way, Luke mentions the number 84, and 84 is a product of 7 times 12. Did I get that right? 7 times 12. And 7 and 12 are numbers in the Bible that represent fulfillment. So is Luke symbolizing us in using the number 84 that this current time in Anna's life now symbolizes the perfection of the fulfillment that she had been waiting for in the promised Messiah? He may be, and that implies another lesson that we then get from Anna's life. That is, God's promises will be kept, even if we must wait for a long time for their fulfillment. Anna has experienced disappointment. She was widowed at a young age. She never remarried, so she never had children, which was a cultural goal in her time. But instead of focusing on what she lost, she focused on her hope in God. We also know that Anna spent time in the temple. Now, the text says that she never left it, implying that the temple was her residence. Now, some scholars say it doesn't mean that she was literally living there, but just that she was there a lot. Either way, the sanctuary, the temple, was central to her life. Now, this does not mean that she has withdrawn into a place of safety and comfort where all the people in the temple share her faith or her approach to life. On the contrary, the temple was populated by many corrupt priests. They weren't so much looking for a coming king as they were looking to maintain their status as religious leaders, and they would compromise their faith to do that. Many of these priests or their successors later put Jesus to death. Anna really doesn't fit in the temple, but she stays, and she prays, and she fasts. Those are her spiritual practices, and they tell us something very important. When you engage in fasting as a formative practice, you are not saying, I am protesting my body shape. Yes. Tons of fasting programs abound on the internet, and they're all directed toward losing weight. Anna, on the other hand, was fasting, and by that act, she was declaring, all is not well. All is not well in the temple. All is not well in Israel. Things weren't right. Israel was in a desperate need of the promised Messiah. Anna believed that promise, and her fasting and praying were focused on fulfillment of God's promise that he would, in fact, redeem Israel. Anna's praying and fasting for years were driven by hope because she remembered what God had done in the past, and she knew he could do it in the future. And the more time she spent in the temple, the more she knew the character of God's history with Israel. She knew that Israel had been called and blessed to be a blessing. She knew, however, that more often than not, they were a blight instead of a blessing. But she always knew that God brought his people back. This knowledge grounded her trust in those promises of God. Anna's not spending all this time in the temple because she has nowhere else to go. Anna is there because she has a mission. And she carries out that mission in a disciplined life of prayer and fasting. And she does this in an atmosphere which, at the very least, where her work is not valued or appreciated, but to use a phrase of past political life, she persists. Anna has us look at the time of the fulfillment of God's promise in Jesus. Let's look at what's going on in chapter 2. We've just got 3 verses about Anna here. And it's time for Jesus to be presented in the temple. Mary has to come there for her rites of purification. Jesus is there for his circumcision and the dedication of the firstborn. And so Mary and Joseph bring Jesus to the temple, and we get a glimpse into their economic status in the previous verses. The only offering they are able to make is a dove. In many of the artwork, much of the artwork that you see about the presentation, somewhere off in a corner they will have little drawings of a bird. You have to look hard for it. But those birds, those doves, represent the fact that Mary and Joseph are not in a favored social class. This is not a family you would look to for a coming king. When they give Jesus to Simeon, who is also a geezer, Simeon immediately recognizes that Jesus is the one who has been promised as the Redeemer of Israel. He sees this little baby, and he says, this is the Messiah. And using the words from Isaiah, he praises God for allowing him to live long enough to see the one who will be the comfort of Israel. But he also says that this coming Messiah will also be a cause of suffering. Simeon, like Anna, has been waiting and hoping for this Redeemer all of his life. I find it interesting that Luke tells us about Simeon by telling us what he said, but he tells us what Anna is like by telling us what she does. For Luke, Simeon and Anna constitute a complete witness to what God is doing. And it's interesting, if you're very familiar with Luke, Luke often pairs a man and a woman to have a complete witness to God. You have Zechariah and Elizabeth, Mary and Joseph, and Simeon and Anna. And this just affirms that a complete witness to the work of God in the world and in our lives requires both words and deeds. Words and deeds. Now, I have a lot of friends who are fond of quoting St. Francis. Preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. This really sounds good, but I have often thought that it's an excuse for not talking about Jesus. I'm uncomfortable talking about Jesus, so I'll just do good things. And the fact of the matter is, St. Francis didn't say it, and he wouldn't say it. St. Francis was an incredibly fiery preacher. He used tons and tons of words, and his words were accompanied by actions. So both are needed, and Luke demonstrates that right at the beginning of his gospel. Well, that's who Anna is, and that's what she does. So what does her disciplined approach to her faith in God teach us? What is the purpose in the practices? Well, let's go back to the temple. As you can see, it's pretty big. I bet some of you have been there. It's big. Mary and Joseph did not make an appointment. You didn't schedule a pastoral meeting. You just went to the temple. Tons of people went to the temple to perform all of these rituals, personal rituals, and it was noisy. Simeon happened to be on duty, and sometime during the presentation, okay, we're Presbyterian and Reformed. Simeon happened to be on duty. Anna happens to walk by, and she immediately recognizes that this child of poor parents is the promised Messiah. Her hope has been realized. She sees Jesus, and she knows who he is. She sees Jesus, and she knows who he is. We live in a world that is desperate to know God. That desperation is sometimes expressed as yearning, and it's sometimes expressed as disappointment, maybe even anger. And it is not just people out in the world who want to see God, to have a sign that he exists and that he cares. It is also a deep desire within the church. We sing, don't we? Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. Or we sing, open the eyes of my heart, Lord. I want to see you. Seeing God is what we all desire. But we live in a time of chaos, randomness, and fear. How do we cut through all of that? We need to return, don't you think, to what some call ritual and what more usually we call practices. I think most of us have heard of that phrase, the tyranny of the urgent. Yeah, and how what is right before us, pressing us for action or resolution, drives everything else out of our concern. It could be good things, work, sometimes work for the church, kids, grandkids. It's a seemingly, as we get older, a seemingly never-ending round of doctor's appointments, political or economic crises, the Super Bowl. But what Anna did was to push her anxieties, and she had them, aside so that she could fast and pray. Remember, fasting was a practice used when things were not right, focusing your prayer and attention on the situation that needed God's intervention and saving power. Anna's surroundings in God's temple with a corrupt priesthood were a daily reminder of why she needed to fast and pray. So Anna walks near a young couple and an old man. Perhaps she heard Simeon quoting familiar words from Isaiah that caught her attention. We just don't know. What we do know is that temple was just a center of bustling rituals. And as I said before, I don't think that it was quiet at all. Yet Anna recognized in all of that chaos and noise, she recognized that the Messiah was there. She saw Jesus. That's the purpose of our submission to the disciplines of faith, to enable us to see Jesus in places where it seems like he's absent or invisible. When we spend time in the scriptures, in prayer, and in worship with the people of God, we can see Jesus when and where others can't. But you know, that vision of God is not for our own spiritual pleasure. It is so that we can tell others. That's what Anna did. Howard Marshall, is a great Scottish New Testament scholar, used to ride his bike all around Aberdeen, Scotland. He's now of blessed memory, but he wrote this: Anna possessed divine insight into things normally hidden from ordinary people, and hence she was able to recognize who the child in the temple was and then to proclaim his significance to those who were interested. Great stress is placed on her age and her single-minded devotion to God. The emphasis on age reminds us that she trusted God fully and that she knew that however long it took, God would send the Messiah King who would bring God's reign and God's blessing. That little baby, brought by poor parents, did not look in any way like someone destined to be a king. But Anna knew. The eyes of her heart had been so trained that by her fasting and prayer, she had divine insight and she had disciplined expectations. Not random expectations, not wishful thinking expectations. She had disciplined expectations that she could see the Lord. We don't engage in the disciplines of Christian formation for the purpose of dry or rote obligation. We don't do it so that we can feel good or perhaps even superior about ourselves. We don't even do it for this now popular issue, mindfulness. The purpose of these practices is to see and to hear the Lord in the chaos of the world and in the deafening voices of the not gods. Jacques Ellul, a French theologian and sociologist, said this. I've paraphrased it a bit. He said, "The measure of the frenzy of our lives is a measure of our alienation, our distance from God. And the further we are from God, the less visible he is, and the less we can hear him when he speaks." So, from this brief mention of Anna, what are we to learn about the purposes in the practices? Number one, the practices enable us to see Jesus when he seems absent. Number two, the practices enable us to be equipped for mission. Number three, the practices enable us to be nurtured in our relationship with God. And here's something, number four, that Anna really teaches us. The practices enable us to choose practices that fit the need of the circumstances. Anna needed to fast because she needed to protest. When we lose touch with God, we have nothing to say to a lost and dying world. Our practices nurture us in the Lord, equip us for mission, and this applies no matter how old you are. I suppose if you reach 105 years old, you can retire from God's calling, but I wouldn't want to run into Anna in heaven if I did that. Folks, Anna has great lessons for us. I would like for you to take a minute now to think about this. As the Lord spoke to Anna, he is speaking to you now. You are in the sanctuary as Anna was in the sanctuary. What is God saying to you in this moment? Take a minute, and then we'll close with prayer.